Make a point, tell a story. Make another point, tell another story. Stories are powerful because they help us interconnect with our audience. And yet, for many people, stories are a big challenge. What do you say? How do you say it? How do you pull the audience into your story? How do you bring your story alive? How do you get your start in storytelling? What are some of the things you should be looking for in doing your story? Tonight, take a look at 3 different storytellers with 3 different styles and see a little bit about how they put their stories together. Find out a little bit about how they work their stories and make their stories into what they are. First person, Anita, is a storyteller who discovered storytelling by hearing a really great storyteller. Caught her attention and pulled her in. And you will hear and see how Anita got involved in storytelling from that intense experience. Anita tells stories that are usually about historical periods or about family situations. Find out a little bit more how Anita does that and makes that happen in her stories in the interview that you're about to see. Our second person is Shannon. Shannon tells humorous stories, and she talks a little bit about how she does the humorous stories, how she builds them up. What are some of the key things you have to have in humorous stories to make them work? Tells a little bit about how she got started in storytelling, what things work for her in storytelling, and just in talking with her, you'll get a sense of the way she tells stories, the structure, the logic, the way everything flows. And our final person interviewing is Cynthia. Cynthia is a very good storyteller who comes from a somewhat different background. Didn't go directly into storytelling thinking I want to be a storyteller, and indeed today, as you'll hear, doesn't even call herself a storyteller. In fact, in Cynthia's case, she had a completely different reason for going into storytelling, and you'll hear what that reason was and how well it has worked. You'll also hear the power, the intensity, and the belief of the way that Cynthia talks, and that comes across in her stories as well. We want to make a point, we need to tell a story. We need to get the audience involved. We need to pull the audience in to this different world. Because once we get the audience fixed in with that story, they remember that story. That story is in their head forever. Whatever point we're trying to make, as long as it's in the story, the audience will remember that point. They may not remember all the details, but they'll remember the story, and the story will remind them of the point. All too often in speaking, you hear speakers who want to try to push their point on the audience. Stories get the point across the audience without the need to push, without the need to force. So we need to examine stories, develop and build our own storytelling abilities. And as you'll shortly hear from these 3 people, there are different paths, different ways to go about it. And these are just 3 different ways to go about developing and building your storytelling abilities. So watch, listen, and learn from these 3 very good storytellers as they tell you more about what works for them in telling their stories. Okay, roll them. Hi.
Hi, how are you?
Fine. You're Anita?
Yes.
And you're a storyteller?
Yes, I am.
And are you a member of a professional storytelling organization? Or?
I am a member of 3 professional
Wow.
storytelling organizations.
How'd you get into that?
Well, I got into it through Toastmasters.
Mm-hmm.
As you know, after you've completed your first 10 speeches, there is a storytelling manual that you can go into where you tell 5 stories. And I just really loved it. And I went to a storytelling festival where I saw, unbeknownst to me at the time, one of the greatest living storytellers that we have in this country right now.
Who is?
Elizabeth Ellis, if I may mention names. And she was just great. She just blew me away. And I said, wow, I want to do that. She said, join your local guild.
What struck you about what she did? What really got you?
Elizabeth Ellis can grab you by the heart, rip it out of your chest, and stomp on it, and you will enjoy the process. So she is good. She is really good. She's originally from Kentucky and now lives in Texas, and she has this southern voice, and she told a story about the South, and it was during the Civil War, and she just made you see what this person was going through, and she made you understand exactly what was at stake.
What have you taken out of this for your own storytelling?
I have learned a very great deal from her. I have since attended some seminars that she has taught, and she is very good at taking a story and turning it around. And she told us, okay, if you have a story, try telling it from the point of view of your feet. I said, what? And she said, yes, tell the story from the point of view of your feet. And it's doable. It's very doable.
Wow.
And if you think of other things that, maybe I could tell this story from the point of view of that plant that's sitting in the corner. What does the plant see while this story is going on?
What other techniques aside from point of view have you learned? Or you use in your stories yourself?
Various different techniques depending on the particular story. Most of my stories are adult stories. I tell stories that have happened to me as a child, stories that my grandfather told me. And I rely heavily upon historical fact, and I rely heavily upon the first person feelings. What is the person who's going through this feeling? And I try to draw my audience into what is that individual going through.
Okay. You told a story about a person, I think it was a relative who was flying or was in war or something like that.
Oh, my Mac story.
Yeah.
Yes, he's not a relative. He just lived up the street from me when I was growing up. But that's the kind of thing that I talk about. Is this man was a veteran of World War II, and he'd been in a prisoner of war camp, and his son then went to Vietnam, and what went through his mind when he was thinking what was happening to his son.
Wow. How did you put yourself in that frame of mind? How did you get that sense of what's going on?
I had spoken to his wife a great deal while this was going on, because of course she didn't have a lot of areas to vent, if you will, because she had to appear to be strong for her husband's sake, and yet she was still worried about her son too.
Right.
So she spoke to me and let me know what her worries were and what his worries were as well.
Interesting. Anything else that you'd say in conclusion that you really use for your stories? How do you use emotions? How do you get emotionally the audience involved in your stories?
To create emotion, I think you have to start with good description. If the person that's listening can see where this individual is standing, if they can hear the noises that are surrounding them, if they can smell the smells, then they know, oh, I can identify with this. I can understand.
So if you have a story talking about a story and the person can really see themselves in the story,
Yes.
that's the best way that's going to really make the story work. Thanks very much. We're out of time, but thanks very much for your thoughts and ideas.
Thank you, Tim.
Welcome.
Hi,
And you are?
I'm Shannon O'Hara.
Shannon O'Hara, and you're a storyteller?
Yes.
Good, good. And how long have you been telling stories?
Well, when I was a kid at the dinner table, there were 6 kids and my parents, and everybody had to tell what they did for the day. And if you just said nothing, that was not allowed. You had to come up with something. And my mother was a librarian, and I think she was working on us to get us to tell a logical story. So I've been telling stories ever since I was little.
Interesting. How do you focus on logic in your stories? What things do you look for?
Well, usually I decide what kind of response I want to evoke in the people. So if I want it to be a humorous story, I'll think, well, what's the crux of the funny part, and then I'll sort of build to that. Or if I want it to be scary, what's the scary thing, and I'll put in things to build to that. So it's always, I have an end result, and I know that you have to have steps to get to that end.
Okay. How do you build that? How do you steer that? So let's say you're telling a scary story. What sort of things are you going to put beforehand to really build up to that?
Well, you set up why this is scary, that, Francine was always afraid of spiders, and when she saw a web in the corner, her heart would stop. And so you get into that, and you just make sure to scatter a lot of webs along the way, or what seem to be webs, or maybe she sees a sack of eggs, or just various other things. So if you know what you're looking for, you want to drop clues that this is coming.
For someone who's just starting out in storytelling or interested in developing their storytelling, what sort of advice would you give?
Well, make sure that you have a beginning, a middle, and an end, which whenever I have frequently worked with children writing stories, and it's very seldom that you can get a beginning, middle, and an end out of anybody under the age of about 14. Then you probably want to put in a lot of extras that do help build the mood, because I got up this morning, I went to the store, I bought milk. It's a story, but it's not a very interesting story. So you want to have something that makes people want to listen. And I always like to have a surprise, and that was something my mother taught me. When we used to have to write those essays for school, what I did on my summer vacation, she would never accept. I went to the pool, I swam, I came home. She always wanted to have something surprising in it, so she might have us write it that I saved someone from drowning, and then it turns out it was my doll that fell in, or something like that. So I recommend always having a surprise.
So how do you build that surprise in? How do you set it up at the beginning and then get to that part where the surprise happens?
Well, again, I think you decide on the mood that you want to have. So if you're trying to have some kind of mystery, or if you're trying to mislead somebody in a humorous way, where you can talk about how you saved somebody and gave mouth to mouth, and then it turns out it was Barbie, you want to set everything up as if you were going to say that you had saved this drowning baby, but then at the last minute you say something about her plastic hair and her hard little plastic face, or something like that, and so then they think, wait, what? And then it was Barbie.
So you talk about the story, but there's something that gives a disconnect, or in the
Right.
sense that, okay, you
But
let them down one
you want to
path.
leave it to the end, because of course if you tell them very early, I saved her but her plastic knees were broken, right away, then they're going to figure out that this is not a real person. So you have to really leave that for the very end, but everything else could be true. You could talk about her beautiful blue eyes and her lovely bathing suit and the matching little shoes and the ponytail holder, and so they get an idea of a person in their head, but that's not really what it is.
How do you build the beginning of the story to pull the audience in and get their attention?
Well, I usually like to have a compelling beginning that makes people want to listen. Like last week, I saved my best friend from drowning, and so people are, what's this? Or I won the lottery, and then I lost it. Something like that. So people think, well, what's this all about? You can't immediately, unlike a newspaper story where you're supposed to tell everything in the first paragraph, you want to give them enough so that they're intrigued and that they'll stay to hear the end of it.
How do you bring the story to life?
I think you want to make people feel that they could be in that position, that this could be this, how would they react, this is the way they would react, or care very much about the people that are in it. So even if if I'm writing about some man who's lost his son, I'm obviously not a man, but other people listening to it could think, oh, that could be my brother, or oh, that could be my son.
And it pulls them into the story that way.
Right.
Well, we're out of time. Thanks very much, Shannon. Very interesting, your thoughts and ideas about storytelling. Welcome.
Hi, Tim.
Hi, and you are?
Cynthia Leggett.
Thanks, Cynthia. Thanks for coming by. You're a storyteller.
Actually, I'm not, Tim. I don't consider myself a storyteller. Growing up with a speech impediment, talking was not natural for me. But I always admired people who would read. And as they would read something, I can just visualize what they were reading. So I think listening to people doing that sort of, I wish I can do that, but by me being a stutterer, I really hesitated. Once I got involved in Toastmasters, got a little more comfortable. So I don't consider myself a natural storyteller, no.
Well, maybe not a natural storyteller, but it's amazing how you've overcome that difficulty of the stuttering into the storytelling. So I've heard you tell some things that are very interesting, very emotional, involved, personal. How did you make that transition from this kind of nervousness about stuttering to getting up in front of people and presenting and telling stories?
Actually, I wonder if perhaps some of it was probably therapy for me in working through something. But what I think, as I've become more involved in it, I've gotten comfortable in hearing my own voice tell the story and actually being affected by it as well.
Your stories that I've heard are very emotional and passionate, very personal. How do you go about writing and creating these stories?
Actually, I don't really write them. I will think of a situation in my life that touched me or one I really grew from. And basically, I'll just outline it and I'll just sort of put myself back at that time and sort of try to relive the feeling, the emotions, be honest how I felt, and at the same time observing what was going on around me at the same time and bringing it together.
How do you go about getting immersed in the story in that way, bringing those emotions inside you to life, or reenacting them, or reliving them? Is it a matter of thinking? Is it a matter of writing them down? Or?
I think it's a matter of thinking for me. It's a matter of thinking and emotion as to just writing, just actually heartily thinking about the situation.
When you're talking about it, you also have a lot of rich descriptions in some of the stories that I've heard. Is that something you just kind of comes out of you as you're talking, or is it something you actually think about beforehand?
Actually, I learned to do that hearing other storytellers as they would describe a situation, and then I realized, going back 1,000 years when I was in grade school, the power of words and language and adjectives in helping develop the picture.
And what have you learned from these other storytellers? What things that you got from them did you really focus on and fasten onto and say, that's a really great idea?
The personal connection, and they would share the story, and it's generally a story that others can relate to. I think those are the best stories, and those are the ones I'll actually tune in more to and pick up techniques that I can use that in my story. I love the way how she did that voice inflection. I love the way how he looked as he said the situation. So that's what works for me and helps me tell stories.
Okay. What sort of voice inflection, what sort of tips, what sort of things really came out to you? You mentioned voice inflection. What other things do you consciously use, or have seen other storytellers consciously use in their stories that you thought was really effective and powerful getting their point across?
Eye contact. Eye contact and effective use of pauses, especially when they're in a story that they're building sort of a climax and they're looking at you and you're just like, what are they going to do next? So it's just the connection of the eyes, the body language, all working in unison.
So the eye contact kind of pulls the person in, gets them involved in the story, and then they get a sense of what's going on.
You can tell a lot, at least I can tell a lot in a person's eyes. You can get their eyes when they're talking.
Who do you decide to make eye contact in the audience with? Is it random, or have you thought about that beforehand?
Actually, I haven't. I obviously probably, if I'm telling the story and I know people in the audience, I would probably make a little more eye contact with them to get comfortable. As I'm getting comfortable in the story, then that's probably when I'm going to start searching the audience for other faces to see if I'm making that connection with them.
Would you then, in that sense, recommend bringing somebody that you know so you can make eye contact with them and then reach out to the room, or is it best to go into a room cold and just look around and see who's out there?
I personally like seeing friendly faces. Personally for me.
So if you got a friendly face, you can focus on
I
that.
can really focus
say,
on that face first, and then once, okay,
Okay,
I got that warm nod,
all right.
and I can
Any final thoughts you give to anybody thinking about developing their storytelling abilities?
just do it.
Just
Do it and listen to people who tell stories, listen to people who do speeches, and say to yourself, what is it I like about that? What's winning me over, and how can I incorporate that in my own speaking?
Thanks very much, Cynthia, for your time.
Thank you, Tim.
You've now heard 3 different speakers talk about 3 different ways they do their stories. 3 different ways these storytellers get across those stories. Think about Anita and how Anita was inspired by a person she saw telling stories. She saw this person telling stories, loved it, and decided that that was something that she wanted to do. Is now with a professional storytellers group. It can be just that simple. Find somebody who's really good at telling stories. Hang around with them, listen to their stories, and if you can, learn from them, talk to them. See if they're willing to teach you, mentor you about how to become a better storyteller. See what things they do well and what things work for them. See why their stories come alive so well. See what their audience likes about their stories. Ask the audience, say, what did you really like about that story? What got you about that story? And then practice doing that. One simple way to become a better storyteller, find other storytellers and learn from them. And think about Shannon. Shannon talked about the importance of building up your stories. And what this means is that in order to build a story, in order to get a story going, you have to have conflict. There has to be a problem that the character or the person in your story is trying to solve. And it's this problem that moves the story forward, that gets the story from point A to point B to point C. This problem to be overcome is what drives the entire story. If you don't have any conflict, you have a very boring story. So always make sure there's some sort of conflict. And if you want to really build the way that Shannon was talking about, really build that story, create new levels of conflict, where one level of conflict is followed by another level of conflict and then another level of conflict. Here's a simple example. So you're telling a story about a person and they're at the airport waiting for their plane and they're just notified there's a 4-hour delay on their plane. 4 hours. Say, okay, they wait. And then they find out 4 hours later there's a 2-hour delay on their plane. That's another level of conflict. The 4 hours is one level, the 2 hours is another level. 2 hours later, they find out that their plane is leaving the next day. And this is the third level of conflict. This level of conflict, they missed what they were going to do in the place they were flying to. They missed their meeting. They missed their appointment. They missed the opportunity. They missed the client. They lose the money. There are a whole bunch of problems that could come out of a flight being delayed. That's an example of a story that can have a whole different level of conflict, and it helps move the story forward. So you want to make your stories interesting, always build and develop and grow that conflict in your stories. And finally, think of Cynthia, our last storyteller, who said she wasn't a storyteller at all. And there's a lot of wisdom in that. So often when we think of storytelling, we think it's a big deal. Maybe we get all caught up in it. try to set up all this complex situations going on and all this really deep underlying tensions going on, and this person knows the other person, but they don't know the third person. And we just think it just becomes a huge, huge deal. But it doesn't need to be that. We do storytelling all the time. May not think about it, but we do. What are you doing? Hey, I just heard about. Wow, did you see that? We tell these stories all the time. It's not a big deal. So even if you don't call yourself a storyteller, doesn't mean you can't be a storyteller. That's 3 ways you can approach doing a story. Maybe you use some of them, and maybe you'll use none of them. Whatever you decide to do in telling your stories, just remember one thing. When you make a point, you need to tell a story.